Welcome to session 3 of the Gospel of the Kingdom of God. Tonight's session is called The Kingdom Comes Through Covenant. So we're going to be talking about covenants and especially the new covenant. But before we get into that, let's do a quick recap. So session 1, we talked about that the gospel is the kingdom of God, that's what the good news is the kingdom of God. And that the word kingdom primarily means the reign and rule of the king. So the kingdom of God is the reign and rule of God. And then finally, we saw that the kingdom of God exists both now among his people and in the future, filling the whole of the earth. In session 2, we saw that Adam and Eve violated the commandment not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which was punishable by death. And we learned that the knowledge of good and evil is an idiom, meaning the right to determine/judge right from wrong. Sort of I get to determine, self-determination. I reject God's right to determine what's right and wrong for my own. And then we saw that mankind has been violating this commandment ever since. This is kind of the way man has gone. And finally, that the good news is that God has made a way to overcome the problem of permanent death by returning to his authority, to his rule and reign. In this session, in part 1, we're going to talk about covenants, and we're going to see that God's kingdom comes through covenants, how God interacts, his rule and reign, and how he interacts with people is through covenants. I should not so much interacts, better words, but how he relates to people is through covenants. Part 2, tonight we will do we'll cover the new covenant, which is the covenant that God made available to all of mankind through Jesus Christ. And then part 3, we'll look at Jesus himself as the mediator of the new covenant, and we'll look at, who is this Jesus? All right, so let's get started with part 1. God's kingdom comes through covenants. So the first question is, what is a covenant? You may not be familiar with that term, or maybe you've heard it, but you're not really sure exactly what it means. Here's what dictionary.com defines it as: an agreement, usually formal, between two or more persons to do or not do something specified. This is really a definition of a contract, right? And that's really what a covenant is. Ultimately, it's an agreement or contract between two parties. And by party, a party can be one person or it could be multiple people. But generally speaking, that's what an agreement is. And in fact, it's what a covenant is. Not necessarily all contracts are like the biblical covenants, but biblical covenants are contracts. Typically, they have benefits that are promised to each party by the other party. And if you think about any kind of contract, you'll know that this is the case. If you hire somebody to mow your lawn, right? The benefit that the other party is providing to you is that they're going to mow the lawn. The benefit you're providing to them is you pay them money, right? So there's typically an exchange of benefits from one party to the other. And then there's typically requirements as well that are promised from each party to the other party. So for example, if I hire someone to mow my lawn, they are required to mow my lawn, right? They're supposed to do that. They've signed up to do that. They'd be letting me down if they didn't mow my lawn, right? But then on me, I'm required to pay them the money. I have to do that, or else I am being unfaithful to the contract. And typically, there are penalties for not upholding your end of the deal, right? They, in a typical contract today, they may sue you or something like that. But there's definitely usually penalties for doing something bad within the contract. Some biblical examples of covenants are treaties between nations. So in 1 Kings 5, for instance, we see a treaty being made between the king of Tyre and Solomon. And so that's a kind of covenant. We see national agreements. So in Jeremiah 34, King Zedekiah makes a national covenant with the people regarding freeing slaves. Personal agreements. So Genesis 31, we saw this one, or well, I don't know, I don't think we read it, but in the midst of the story of Laban and Jacob, they make a covenant together. Laban wants to make this covenant to hold Jacob to being good to his daughters and grandchildren. And then in 1 Samuel 18, this is where Jonathan and David make a covenant. So these are personal agreements between individuals. And then marriage is a covenant. It's not typically called by that, but in Malachi 2:14, it is called a covenant. But it is a covenant. And if you think about it, it's two parties that are making promises to each other. They're going to provide benefits, but there are requirements that they each have. And there are penalties for failing to uphold your end of the deal. So marriage. Another example that I don't have listed that I think is really interesting, that is a covenant, but you're not really going to see it called that in the scriptures, is a family covenant. When you're born into a family with you and your parents, you have a family covenant. It's not something that you signed up for, but you are a part of it, right? And we all know this, right? Parents have an obligation to care for their children, and children have an obligation to honor their parents, right? And then later, children have an obligation for caring for their parents. And even though there was no formal contract signed, no covenant initiated between them, that covenant exists in that family. And, it's dishonorable to not honor your covenant with your family members. All right, let's look at a few of the Old Testament covenant terms. This gets a little technical, but I think it's important because as we talk about covenants tonight, there's aspects. If you do a word study through the Old Testament, you can do a search for the word covenant, and you'll find it used many, many times in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. But what you're not going to see is that the word covenant isn't the only covenant term or terminology. And that's what I mean by terms. It's maybe a little bit of a misnomer there. I don't mean the terms of a covenant. I mean the terminology used for covenants. And so the word covenant is used, but some other words are used as well. And they tell you that you're dealing with a covenant when those terms are used. So the first is the word covenant in Hebrew is berit, and it just means a covenant. When the Hebrew words hesed and emet are used, those words mean faithful and loyal love, and those are covenant terms. And especially in covenant context, they are specifically talking about your attitude in the covenant, the things that you're supposed to do in the covenant and stuff like that. So it's faithfulness, it's loyalty and love in the covenant. The word righteous, which is sadiq in Hebrew, means proper conduct under the terms of the covenant, including fulfilling one's obligations. The phrase cut a covenant, or a lot of times in your modern English Bibles, it'll say, made a covenant or make a covenant. But in the underlying Hebrew, it's the word karat berit, and karat means to cut. And this is the phrase that is used to initiate a covenant that doesn't exist yet. And so we'll see a few examples here in a minute, but when a covenant is going to get cut, this phrase gets used. The other phrase that gets used, and this gets a little bit confusing, because of how it gets translated. It's the I'm definitely pronouncing it incorrectly, but it's Hakim Berit. And that word Hakim means to affirm or establish something. It actually means to like stand, like to stand up. But in a covenant context, it means establishing or affirming a covenant. But in this case, it's not talking about initiating a new covenant. It means that a previously established covenant is being affirmed, sometimes modified. And we'll see a couple of examples of covenants that were previously established that later get modified. And so if you'd like more information, we're not going to go real in depth on a lot of the stuff that I'm sharing with you tonight. I'm not going to go through tons of verses, proving all of these things. If you'd like more information, I recommend the book Kingdom Through Covenant by Peter Gentry and Stephen Wellum. They have a shorter format version of that same material in a book called God's Kingdom Through God's Covenants. And but I definitely recommend the book Kingdom Through Covenant. It's very thorough. It's a big book, big thick book, and but it's exhaustive in this particular subject. Let's talk about how God establishes relationship through covenant. So one of the things, contracts in general do this, but covenants in particular do it at a little bit of a deeper level. And some like a marriage contract certainly would be at this level, but a contract always establishes a relationship between two parties. In a covenant, especially in biblical covenants, we're establishing a deep tie. So again, marriage is a good example where you see it's pretty obvious you're creating this close relationship and connection. And so covenants typically in the scriptures are designed to do that. They're not always friendly. Laban and Jacob is a good example of that, but it is creating this deep tie, this deep relationship between the two of them. So God, he creates relationship with people through covenants. That's how he does it. And Genesis 15 is a good example of that, where he makes a covenant with Abram. And in verse 18, it says, on that day, the Lord made a covenant. That's our word cut, right? Cut a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants, I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. And so here we see he's establishing a relationship with Abram in this covenant, but not only to Abram, but also to his descendants. So Abram's descendants are also going to come into relationship with God through this covenant. Also, God is solving the problem of sin through covenant. So sin breaks the relationship with God. So we saw that with Adam and Eve. God had established a relationship with them, but then they went and rejected his authority and his relationship with them by rejecting the authority that he had over them. And so sin breaks our relationship with God. Covenants bring it back. And so it's through covenants that God is dealing and solving the problem of sin. So for instance, in Jeremiah chapter 31, we'll read verses 31 and then skip down to verse 34. Verse 31, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Verse 34, they will not teach again, each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wrongdoing, and their sin I will no longer remember. So you can see how, again, God is solving the problem of sin and the relationship breakdown that sin brings through covenant. I want to talk about the covenant relationship real quick. This is the typical covenant relationship with God has several components to it. And so the first is that God graciously offers to enter into a covenant. One of the misnomers that gets talked about in Christianity a lot is the idea that the new covenant, the covenant that God made through Jesus, is a covenant of grace, and it does get called that. But what folks don't typically realize is the other covenants were covenants of grace as well. God did not have to make a covenant with Abraham. God did not have to make a covenant with the people of Israel, right? He offered those covenants graciously through grace. And in fact, the Jews of Jesus's day, we have a lot of their writings, they absolutely saw the covenant that God made with the Israelites through Moses as a covenant of grace. So God offers the covenant through grace, and then people come into the covenant through faith and grace. And so this is typically so. Abraham, for instance, when he makes the covenant with Abraham, he offers it to Abraham, and Abraham comes into that covenant through faith. And then finally, the covenantal partners, and this is both God and the people, are to be faithful to the terms of the covenant. And this is what is meant by righteousness. That when we see phrases like the righteousness of God, what it's talking about is God's faithfulness to the terms of the covenant. When it talks about our righteousness, it's talking about our faithfulness to the terms of the covenant. Righteousness is not synonymous. It's not 100% synonymous with, say, morality, for instance. That's not really what the word means. Righteousness means proper conduct in the social context. And in the context of covenant, it means proper conduct in terms of the terms of that covenant. And so if you're being faithful to the terms of the covenant that you're in, then you're righteous. And that's what that word means. So this is the sort of the three steps of covenant relationship with God. God offers the relationship through the covenant that he's offering. And then the person responds in faith to that grace. They come into it through that grace that God has offered through their faith. But then both covenantal partners, both God and the people, are required to be faithful to the terms of that covenant in order to be righteous. So let's look at a few of the examples that God of covenants that God has made with people. And we'll see these are sort of the major ones in the scriptures, the major covenants in the scriptures. And one thing that's really good to approach the scriptures with an understanding of this framework, the framework of the covenants, because the best way to understand the narrative story of the Bible is to understand it in terms of the covenants that God has made with people over time and how things change as a new covenant comes into effect, or something is initiated about a covenant, or a covenant gets modified, affects things along the way. And so understanding the covenants in the Bible will help you understand the Bible as a whole. So we just want to look at this briefly. So the creation covenant is the first one. It's not called a covenant in the first chapters of Genesis. Scholars debate. There's a verse in Hosea that scholars debate about whether or not it talks about a covenant and with Adam. But it might be Adam as in the first man, or it might be there was a city in Israel called Adam. So they debate about that. But there is covenant language. Remember how we talked about there's other terms beside the word covenant that clue you in that we're talking about that subject. And so, and just from a logical standpoint, you can see that a covenant has been created here. I personally believe that the reason that we don't see a covenant ceremony or something like that, is because God created Adam and Eve directly. It's a parent-child direct relationship, and so the covenant is internal to the relationship. It doesn't have to be entered into. Just no different than my wife and I have 3 children. I didn't make a covenant with those children, but we are in a covenant together. So I believe that's why we don't see that term being used. But the language, the other terms are there for this thing, and we see the relationship there. And so this creation covenant where we see these commands from God, these expectations, these benefits and requirements, those are all there. Then we see that covenant gets renewed with Noah. So it's interesting because Noah in Genesis 9 is the first place where the term berit is used. That word for covenant is used. And so it would look like God is making a covenant with Noah, like initiating a new covenant, but the actual terminology is indicating this is a renewal of an existing covenant. And that would go back to that creation covenant. And in fact, God modifies, when he renews that covenant with Noah, he actually modifies some things in that covenant. But other things remain, like marriage, monogamous marriage is part of that original covenant. And that remains as a stipulation even unto today. The covenant with Abraham is the next covenant. And this is one that God initiates and begins a whole process where God is trying to resolve the problem of sin and death. And then we see that, and that's in Genesis 15, we see that covenant then renewed with Abraham, and then we see it renewed again with Isaac and Jacob. And then we see the covenant made with Israel. This is a new covenant, but it's within the context of the covenant with Abraham. It does not nullify the covenant with Abraham or the creation covenant. Those are still in effect for the people of Israel. But God is making a covenant specifically with them because he's giving them land. And so this particular covenant has aspects to it that have to do with, stipulations about a land grant. And so there's stuff going on there. And then that covenant, which was originally made at Sinai, gets renewed right before they go into the promised land. And again, some things are changed. There's some stipulations are made. I should say the covenant with Abraham, when it gets renewed in Genesis 17, some stipulations get added at that time. Then we see a covenant that's made with David, and for 2 Samuel 7, and that covenant is made specifically with David and his descendants, who would be sons who were kings. Right. So this is a particular lineage. Basically, God is promising David through this covenant that the Messiah is going to be one of his sons who will be king and whose kingdom will never end. And then finally, we have the new covenant, which is offered to all people. And we'll talk about that at length in the next section. So let's do a quick review. A covenant is an agreement between 2 or more people with benefits, requirements, and penalties. The Old Testament covenants included things like international treaties, national agreements, personal agreements, and marriages. The covenants were initiated, but then they could be reaffirmed, they could be modified, things like that. The parties to the covenant are expected to show steadfast love and loyalty within the covenant, that there are requirements and they're supposed to be faithful to those requirements, both parties. Parties that are faithful to their requirements of the covenant are considered righteous. And finally, God works through covenants to establish formal relationships with mankind. And so we'll pick up the new covenant in the next section.